I'm Nicola Talent, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts. Let's start this story with the day Stephen Cameron is driving along. He's a passenger in a car, and there's a road rage incident.
Yeah, and it's a classic kind of, it was a road rage incident. It was a pretty standard road rage incident in 1996. And it got out of hand, and I think the opening line of the book is basically the red mist descended and only one man was left standing. And that was effectively it. It was described by the judge subsequently as a very banal incident with a hugely tragic and formidable and unbelievable outcome. And that outcome was obviously delivered at the hands of a knife. Throughout most of the interaction, which may have lasted for over a minute, it was clear from most of the witnesses that Kenneth Noye was getting the worst of it, was getting pretty badly beaten up by somebody who was 21 years of age, who was a part-time doorman, security guy. He was an occasional kickboxer who obviously could look after himself and very formidable, was several inches taller than the 5'9" Kenneth Noye, and Kenneth Noye was 50-51. So this was quite an uneven fight, and Noye thought in his testimony that he was not going to make it back to the car, so he took a knife out, a penknife, and he used it twice. There was some testimony which claimed that he'd gone back to the car and taken a knife from the car, and that was disputed. And that was kind of quite important about whether this was manslaughter or murder. In any case, outrageous and devastating outcome for Stephen Cameron, age 21. His girlfriend, Danielle Cable, who is going to play a substantial part in the rest of the story, was there in tears. Stephen's parents lived nearby. They raced to the scene. There were private ambulances collected them, but the damage, just as luck would have it, hundreds and thousands of kind of small nicks and stab wounds, and most of them are never fatal, and this was a fatal blow. Kenneth Noye didn't realize that he'd killed him because Stephen Cameron was still standing as he left the scene, and then he went off to clean up at a friend's house and then went to a pub and had a Sunday pub lunch. Meanwhile, in another little installment of his extraordinary story, a guy called Alan de Cabral was a witness to this, and his evidence kind of changed and became quite lurid and sensational as he came to court, that may have had something to do, which we deal with later in the correspondence, is that he was carrying a load of cocaine in the back of his car at that time. He witnessed the attack, and he later testified that Kenneth Noye was smiling as he came away from the scene of the attack. Highly unlikely that happened. In any event, about 6 months before his trial, Alan Cabral was arrested and found with 56 guns, 126 pounds of cash, a load of cocaine, and a car with all sorts of compartments. This was a serious drug dealer.
And this guy happened to be a witness to one of the most famous criminal incidents in the UK history.
And so here he is. So he phones up 10 minutes late, and he's thinking, right, I've got to get away from the scene because the police are going to descend and I've got cocaine in the back. And at the same time he must be thinking, this is something I can use down the line to arbitrage if I need to call in any favors, because in the background, Kenneth Noye was public enemy number one. And he was public enemy number one for one key reason. One, he was involved in the Brinks Mat and convicted for 14 years of involvement in the fencing and laundering of the proceeds from the Brinks Mat robbery. And additionally, during the course of that investigation, an undercover police officer dressed up in what I think was described in court as ninja outfit, without any police ID, snuck onto his property with another police officer. This was in Kingswood in Kent, a Hollywood cottage, a huge kind of 25 acres bit of land. And at the time, Kenneth Noye was scared of, he had gold, in on the property. It's not clear if it was Brinks Mat gold. In fact, it's much more likely that it was Brazilian gold. But in any event, the undercover police officer, DC John Fordham, came on the property, and instead of retreating when the dogs in the property alerted Noye to this intrusion, and Noye grabbed a knife from his car, a small knife, which he'd used to clean out a kind of battery. And in fact, actually, there was a problem with the battery because the police had placed a bug in the car, which had been drained with the battery. So all quite complicated. But tragically, DC Fordham, according to the evidence of the state pathologist, confronted Noye instead of running. And Noye felt his life was in danger, and he stabbed DC Fordham, and DC Fordham died. And in the first ever case of the death of a police officer, the Kenny Noye was acquitted. And I remember following this when I was undercover. I think I was undercover on the doors in Nottingham. No, I think I've got the county year right. But I remember following the case and assuming that this is a criminal got away with murder. But when you actually look at that's a tabloid, like, you get that, okay, it's very convenient to say somebody, got away with murder. The reality was it was a very emphatic jury verdict. But I looked at all the transcripts, and not very few people have those transcripts. And it was clear, if you'd followed the trajectory of the court, listened to what the jury heard. And in fact, the most persuasive witness in that was actually the pathologist for the state. So the state pathologist, said, listen, the first blows came from DC Fordham, and as a result, he was acquitted. And he was acquitted. Nonetheless, he killed a policeman and would doubtless never be forgiven by the newspapers or tabloids. And indeed, he was kept in custody, and he was convicted of laundering the Brinks Mat gold, and got a very substantial sentence, 14 years and serving 9. And then when he'd come out in 1993, on and off on a license, and then in 1996, life was looking up for him. He's a very astute and sharp businessman, and many of these entrepreneurial villains. If you place them in the city, they'd invent the Wolf of Wall Street. Just super fast brains. They know literally they can make a book on anything. Just so happens, and Kenny Noye always says that, listen, if there's a gray area, I'll always take advantage. But he's as a legitimate businessman, he certainly had a fine track record. And obviously there was plenty of grey areas and illegitimate work going on. So at the time... So
this day in May 1996, it sounds like sort of the opening of a Quentin Tarantino film. You have Stephen Cameron, this 21-year-old boxer, in one car. You have this road rage incident involving a guy, Kenny Noye, and a witness who is a massive big cocaine dealer to what happened. Noye takes out a knife, stabs Stephen Cameron. Unfortunately, it's fatal. He does a runner, but the background story to Noye is fascinating. He's been involved in the Brinks Mat Robbery, and he's also been involved in this killing of a policeman, for which he's acquitted, but he's nonetheless got a really hefty jail term. He's actually on licence, isn't he, when this road rage happens? I think
by the time his licence was just either coming up, it was a 3, because he'd served quite a long sentence. So it would have been either just coming more or less to the end. And so life was looking up for him, and this moment of madness. And it's rather strange, because this is the enigma of Kenny Noye, and it's this: throughout 30 years he spent in prison, he's had a complete blemish-free record. And prisons are inherently violent places, and if you've got a reputation like Kenny Noye, then people will be confronting you and trying to take you out and challenge you. And so he has withstood those pressures within the prison system over here, in some of the most serious category A, category AAA prisons, without a blemish on his prison record, for not one marker for violence. And before the death of DC Fordham, he was in his 40s. There was no record of violence on the intelligence. So it was bizarre that these two tragic incidents label him, as you rightfully say, this is a man who's killed 2 people, convicted of murdering 1 person. But he is, after he kills Stephen Cameron then is brought to hospital, pronounced dead. He sees on Sky News the confirmation of a road rage incident, and police are seeking out the driver of a Land Rover or Discovery type vehicle. And what was interesting was he thought at the time exactly like any other police officer. Nick Biddis would eventually become the SIO, Senior Investigating Officer from Kent Police. So Nick Biddis adjudicated, as Kenny Noye adjudicated at the time, that this was a self-solver, that there'd be CCTV. This was close to the Dartford Tunnel. There was CCTV everywhere. This was still in the last, I suppose, the dwindling years of the IRA years in London and those threats. So London was the most CCTV'd up and its environs city in the world. And so the conjecture was Sunday afternoon, drivers, 30 or 40 witnesses, cameras everywhere. Clearly, this was going to be a self-solver. They were going to get the number plate. They were going to get IDs. In any event, the cameras didn't work. The witnesses were unsatisfactory. Nothing was ever resolved. Kenny Noye thought, like Nick Biddis, that this was a self-solver. He had to get away, and he was going to get away and let the statements be taken and see what they got before he might return and either fight for a manslaughter or a self-defense. As it happens, there was no evidence. And unbelievably, at the end, if Kenny Noye had done nothing, literally just gone home, got rid of the clothes he was in, there would have been no evidence linking him to the scene. Because within 2 weeks of him, of the death, Danielle Cable and Alan de Cabrel were given photographs of Kenny Noye, and they couldn't identify him.
Right.
And there was no DNA. There was nothing to link him to the scene. The only thing which linked him to the scene were all the actions he took to flee the scene, to flee the country, and he went to elaborate lengths to replace his car and get rid of the car, and all kind of avenues and arrows were saying, okay, well, who's left? Who's left? And nobody could who's left the scene? And the reality was this was going to be a local murder, a local killing, somebody on a Sunday drive. They were going to live pretty close to the scene, even though nationally there were about 17,000 potential Land Rover Discoveries, which could have been potential vehicles. So basically, there was no evidence linking him to the scene, but he fled nonetheless, and he fled in grand style.
But road rage was a huge, big story then. And was it because of this Kenneth Noye incident purely, or was there other incidents? I can kind of recall there was a lot of sort of, fear about road rages, and almost certain smaller incidents were being blown out of all proportion. But perhaps it was because of this.
It was because of this, and the kind of a moral panic developed in and around this incident, because with the road rage, we all get annoyed in the car. We're all effing and blind, and sometimes are muttering under our breath at the kids in the back of the car and railing and this. And sometimes people get out of the car, some people shout, and then it kind of peters out. And sometimes, two people who should not be brought together by incidents like this. And then if you bring a knife to a fight like that, then obviously there's always a risk that someone could die. But the other extraordinary bit, and the background to this, is that obviously John Palmer, who was known as Goldfinger, who ran the massive property empire and was involved in the Brinks Mat. He got acquitted on Brinks Mat. It was worth over £300 million at this stage. He was a timeshare kind of baron, and he put all his resources. He was a very good friend of Kenny Noye's at this stage, and he put all his resources behind Kenny Noye to get him out of the country. They flew out in a helicopter, £1 million helicopter, out to France, to John Palmer's estate in Normandy, and then they took a train up the next day from Normandy to an airport outside Paris, where a Learjet flew in from Moscow to take him out to Tenerife, where he laid low, and there he was able to indulge and live in some of the various properties and timeshare properties that John Palmer, who was he was named as 105 on the Sunday Times rich list, and the Queen was 106. So this is a powerful and extraordinary character. And so Kenny Noye was now relying upon his wealth and his contacts. And so in the first couple of weeks, Kenny Noye travels to Spain, to France, to Morocco, to the Ivory Coast, and having left UK airspace, and at no stage was he ever asked for a passport or ID documents, because when they arrived on one of their journeys into Madrid airport, they were put into VIP lanes, and limos were brought in to take them off the Learjet, brought into hotels, and so this was the life of a life of luxury, which didn't stop even though he was on the run.
I can just see literally in my head, I can see the tabloid newspapers coming off the printing presses. The amount of kind of, wow bits to that whole story are just incredible. And, obviously sympathies to Stephen Cameron and his family. But, having Kenny Noye and John Palmer Goldfinger in the middle of this and this idea that they flee into luxury. And of course, that's what gave this story legs and, meant that we're still talking about it today. Now, what happened and how long did Noye stay on the run?
Well, he stayed on the run for 2.5 years, which is quite extraordinary because according to some ministerial records, the police were able to employ the services of MI5, MI6. Obviously, Interpol were involved. But for 2.5 years, he stayed on the run successfully, and eventually he kind of left the protection of Jean Palmer and decided he had to kind of rely upon his own wits, and he traveled across South America. He traveled to the Caribbean, Africa, in Spain. He settled down in just close, about an hour from the coast of Gibraltar, and he settled down there away from the Costa del Sol, away from Marbella, but within 2 hours of Marbella. But he basically kind of laid low, invented a life, and he did everything which nobody expected of him. He went to South America, he went to Cuba, he took a lover, he spent a great deal of time in the Caribbean, and he became more traveled. And while he was abroad, he still was able to, through pretty kind of unsophisticated techniques, can engage with some of his old contacts, his family, and arrange for passports. He got legal advice. But at this stage, because the police were aware he was effectively the number one suspect, he wasn't arrested. There was no warrant for his arrest. There was a blue warrant in Interpol for the police in the UK to be warned or to be informed if he was spotted. But effectively, so anybody offering him help was kind of immune from any prosecution because he wasn't a wanted man, and they knew that although the only evidence they really had on Kenny Noye was the fact all the efforts he made at fleeing the scene. So they needed to get another ID from Danielle Cable, which they subsequently did get after 2.5 years. But for a great deal of time, Kenny Noye, just lived an extraordinary life of freedom and luxury.
So he was essentially on the run from the investigation rather than from pending charges, because they were presumably all the while trying to build a case for the Director of Prosecutions, and while they had Noye as their central character, they had to build a case around him and his movements.
You're absolutely right. So they built the case around them with Danielle Cable as the chief witness and Alan de Cabral, the big drug dealer. But the reality was their IDs would not have worked because obviously after they had failed to identify Kenny Noye from very good photographs, as Nick Bitter said, they then it was announced in the late departed News of the World. Ian Edmondson and Gary Jones at News of the World had done a big splash to say he was the number one suspect, and then his photograph was around the world. So clearly, any identification of him was going to be problematic, particularly in view of the fact that before the newspaper identified him as the number one suspect, the key witnesses could not identify him. So nonetheless, they decided to try and get Danielle Cable over to Spain when they finally tracked him down. Now, there's been a myth about and all sorts of stories about how he was tracked down, and was it underworld Supergrasses? Was it, it's a whispering city, as you know, the underworld. But actually, it was very banal in that there was an accidental sighting of him in Cadiz, close to Barbarte, where he lived, on the coast, pretty remote coast of Spain. And it's a real horse racing and horse jumping country. And he accidentally, didn't intend, at this show jumping event, and he turned around, he bumped into a couple he knew from Kent, and the couple were law abiding, but he bumped into them, they bumped into him, and they knew this is one of the most wanted men in the world. The only other person on the radar was probably Whitey Bulger, who was on the run for much longer, but at the same time in the US. And they bumped into him, he saw them, and they exchanged pleasantries. What do you do? They now knew, oh God, the last thing we want to do is to bump into somebody who's one of the most wanted men in the world. And the last thing he wants to do is to bump into them. Anyway, so without asking, they prompted one of the couple. The mom had said, listen, don't worry, Ken, if it comes to it, if you're caught, it won't have anything to do with us. About a month or so later, it's not too sure exactly how, but clearly a statement was written. It may have been the fact that they went to the police themselves. It may have been the fact that they disclosed this sighting to somebody else and they went to the police. Either which way, a statement was given to the police, and which I was able to very recently to confirm. And this couple basically wrote and said about the whereabouts of Kenny Noye and linked him into Cadiz, just a couple of miles from where actually he was based. Suddenly, not only that, during his interaction with this couple, he answered a phone call to one of his sons, which then basically they were able to connect the son's phone to his phone, and this was, some fatal mistakes. And some might think, well, Kenny Noye was getting quite lackadaisical on the run. His family were coming backwards and forth. He saw some key contacts. He was living a pretty privileged life and had access to family, access to cash, and access to old associates. So you might wonder why he hadn't been caught before. In any case, the big breakthrough came when he was located here in Cadiz, and then they decided to basically record all the phone calls, tap all the phone calls, and then send people over, and they engaged with the local police and were able to track him down. And then they got Danielle Cable over to identify him in locus. And once they did that, they were able to use that to get a warrant for his arrest. And then they eventually nailed him after nearly 2.5 years in the run, which is,
So the trial at the Old Bailey, their key obviously witness is Danielle Cable, who's to go into witness protection program because him and the people around him are deemed so dangerous. But what happens during the trial?
Well, during the trial, she gave good evidence. I mean, Kenny Noye came out in this book and he says there was never a threat against her. And he said she gave good evidence. And, most of the evidence pointed to, a ruckus and a fight. And she obviously said that she didn't say that Stephen was the instigator, but in all other respects, Kenny Noye and his team wouldn't really have had much problem with it, because once initially in Spain before the extradition, and he fought extradition, he denied ever being present at the scene. But when he came over to the UK, he admitted he was there. He said it was self-defense, and that Stephen, or at the least, or possibly manslaughter. What had happened then was, so she gave good evidence, but at this stage she went into witness protection a couple of months before the start of the trial, and maybe a bit longer. And then, but during the trial, Alan de Cabrals gave fantastical evidence. The judge described him as the unforgettable Alan de Cabral. Now, this was the big drug dealer. He was 27 stone, and this was a man who arrived in the dock, and his phone goes off in the dock. Anyway, he tells the jury that he took down the full number, and he adds all sorts of extraneous details which never happened, because obviously the 999 call was recorded. Nonetheless, he does give the key bits of evidence. He said, as Kenny Noye walked away from the scene, Kenny Noye smirked as if that will show them, and Kenny Noye obviously discounted that. At this stage, Kenny Noye's team had no idea that Alan de Cabrel was a major drug dealer. Least of all, they had no idea that he had been arrested just 6 months or so before the trial and been found with 56 guns, £126,000 worth of cash, a car which is full of false compartments for smuggling drugs, guns, and cash. And so the cops, HMRC, raided him with armed police, and then he got a little rap on the knuckles. So this was he was caught with so much drugs and cash that the case could have been made that he would get 16 to 20 years in prison. Instead, he got no time, a rap on the knuckles, and he got his cash returned to him, his guns returned to him, and his obviously the drugs were taken away, and he didn't get his car back, which is worth over £20,000, until after he gave evidence, raising the suspicion later on that he was being bribed with this. But so the jury had no idea about his past or about the fact that he got an easy ride with the police. And of course, if you had known that as a defense witness, defense barrister, you would be making heavy play of it. Now, the difference is, it didn't make the difference between whether Kenny Noye brought a knife to a fight, which he did, or whether Stephen Cameron died, which he did. But it was absolutely crucial to the difference between manslaughter and murder. And so obviously, if you're putting a gleeful click in your heels as you've killed somebody, then obviously it's not going to play well with the jury. But during that trial, his de Cabrel's ex-wife, well, they were separated, phoned up the court and asking to talk to the defense team, because she said, and the defense team, because it was her view that everything Alan de Cabrel said was lies. He had told the jury that he was going for a drive, testing his car, which is in repairs. No, he wasn't. He was going to deliver drugs. He said he'd come from Mass. He brought his kids to Mass. He hadn't been to Mass in 16 years, and he said he hadn't taken any recreational drugs, when in fact his wife was saying he was a major drug addict as well as drug dealer. And she was phoning up, and of course the clerks at the court were saying, listen, you've got to talk to, you can't talk to the judge, you've got to talk to the defense barrister. So she got the name of Batten, which is another QC, and she phoned the wrong Batten, and he thought, what the hell are you talking about? So, during the trial, there was this amazing event which could have happened, but which passed by. Then Kenny Noye went on to get convicted, and then about 4 months after his conviction, she contacts him in prison to say, listen, this is what happened. My husband gave false testimony against you, and it's a load of nonsense. And really, I felt you could have done with some being able to challenge that. This was extraordinary. There was an appeal, and this was obviously going to help his appeal, because the difference between manslaughter and murder in that situation, it was quite thin. A thin sliver in legal terms. This was not a premeditated attack. It was a fight which went wrong. Classic manslaughter, but you bring a knife to a fight, well, there's always a risk that somebody could be murdered, and that is your mens rea, and that basically can move it to murder. But a lot of police officers have said, if it wasn't Kenny Noye, it could easily have been manslaughter. In any case, these decisions were very tightly fought, because there was some suggestion that Kenny Noye might have been convicted for manslaughter in relation to the death of DC Fordham, but had chosen self-defense, and that the police had gone for murder when it might have been better for manslaughter. In this case, they went for murder, and Noye was convicted. But there was a big appeal now coming up, because not only was de Cabrel now a discredited witness, but there was also evidence that the pathologist in the case was also discredited, and about 7 to 10 of the trials of the pathologists, one of the pathologists in the case who gave evidence, which again gave evidence about force and blow and motivation, which would point to the difference between manslaughter and murder, he was discredited, and a lot of his trials were overturned. So when it came to appeal, this was going to look great, but something unbelievable happened. So Alan de Cabrel, who was now obviously the bête noire, he was the sword in the side of Kenny Noye during the trial, but now with this new evidence, which the state conceded, he was now potentially the get out of jail clause and for a retrial and an appeal. But with about 8 months after the trial, he was shot dead. And inevitably, people said, murdered, executed, gang style. And people thought, hold on, it must be Kenny Noye took him out. But anybody who knew the case would be saying, are you kidding me? This guy's testimony, in the dock, and he'd have been directed, subpoenaed to the court for any appeal, would have been the ticket out of jail for Kenny Noye for an appeal. In any case, he died. He was, and his death remains unsolved. Kenny Noye tried subsequent appeals and then spent 21 years in prison.
So you've spoken to him, and he's in his 70s now, is he?
Yeah, he's 75. And I think, I've spoken to him. Very few journalists, in fact, no other journalists have had any close access to him at all. Obviously, plenty of officers and police officers had plenty of contact with him over the year. He was long regarded as, as a mover and shaker and as a fence, and a guy who's very smart businessman. He was also very, very charming. He also had a long reputation for being a member of the Masons and using the Masons as an opportunity to curry favor with the police officers. Allegations that he had corrupted police officers, pretty strong allegations. Nobody's been specifically convicted. But this is a man at the center of all these key signal crimes: Brinks Mat, the death of DC John Fordham, and the road rage incident. Three key incidents, like the Brinks Mat, now the subject of the Major Gold series now on BBC One. And and so the conundrum is, this is not a man who's inherently violent, and yet two men are now dead, and he continues to breathe. But my interactions with him, and he spent 30 years in prison, 21 years for this sentence. The baseline sentence was 16 years, and there was a lot of political pressure because the press and the tabloids, they would have, as you'd imagine, demonized him. But he'd done his time, and I think we brought him together with Ian Brown, who was a colleague of DC Fordham, and he accepted that, which I think he didn't at the time, but he accepted in the company of Kenny Noye, 40 years on after DC Fordham's death, that the verdict was, he accepted the verdict, and it wasn't an aberrant verdict. It was, it was a very reasonable verdict. It's not a verdict necessarily that police officers would have wanted, but, it wasn't, some outrageous decision. So he accepted the self-defense plea of Kenny Noye and the fact that was reasonable. And they got together, and you got a sense is that after two major players, a major police officer and a major villain get together, they've now, both are retired in every sense. And you got a real insight into the social history of those 4 or 5 decades of crime, and although Kenny Noye wasn't a bank robber, he could speak to, that era. He could speak to the era of the Flying Squad and the Sweeney and John Thaw, and remarkable insight. But I found it to be, now, very charming, very open, and very contrite. In the book, we don't state anything as fact. I wrote it with Karl Hauman and a colleague, but we don't state anything as fact. We just lay it out for
what he has to say.
And then we also counteract it with the lead investigator, Nick Biddis, and also with Ian Brown and other contributors. So we balance his contribution, I think quite delicately. And at the heart of it, and Stephen Cameron's death watermarks it all. But I think I also try and look at it from a criminological perspective, and I also believe personally that if you've done your time, you've done your time. And I work with a charity, the AP Foundation, where we bring, peer-to-peer ex-offenders meeting with young offenders and trying to, prevent that cycle and that life cycle of crime. And so, I think you've got to take him as he is. He appears to be very contrite for the events which happened, and he's moved on with his life. He's still under license. And the one, I think, poignant thing he did say was that he said, it was only in the postscript, but it did make the front page of the Mirror the other day over here. He said that there was no reason for Danielle Cable to remain in in witness protection because, you know, he clearly would never have been released on license if there was if parole board, who would have access to all the intelligence, thought there was any risk to him causing Danielle Cable at any stage. You know, she went into witness protection about 3 years after the incident, about 6 or a couple of months before the trial. And he claims that she was never at risk. But in any case, as he now runs free, there's no reason why she shouldn't be free from witness protection.
So does he, or do you, having looked at the case, believe that it was the death of the police officer, the undercover surveillance officer, John Fordham, that maybe gave police the future appetite to go for Noye in such a way?
Well, I think they're very open about it. You know, of course, that's the human condition. You know, it's hugely visceral. Even for Ian Brown, it's a huge visceral. Your colleague is killed in controversial circumstances. I mean, to be honest, it appeared to be kind of badly organized and not particularly well or orchestrated kind of raid or surveillance. One would have thought they would have anticipated that there were dogs on site, and they didn't seem to take that into account. But you kill a police officer in any country in the world, and other police officers are not going to take too kindly, and they will. And the sense was that they were going to make sure they were going to get him. And so, to avoid that, you better not get in trouble with the law. Exactly. And in many ways, the Brinks Mat conviction was, quite predictable. What the events surrounding the death of Stephen Cameron was just ludicrously unlucky, tragic, catastrophic. And devastating, of course, for Stephen Cameron's family in particular.
And at his age now, Noye is going to live out his years with freedom, presumably, but he will be very aware of his former pal and the guy who helped him, John Palmer Goldfinger, who died, was assassinated while he was doing the gardening. A guy who had sort of gone into retirement, shall we say. There's always a bullet waiting for these people, I think. Does Noye feel that sense of danger?
No, I think when interesting, when John Palmer died, the police visited Kenny Noye, and we have it in the book, and they asked him, do you know anything about it? They knew he didn't have anything to do with it because he got on well with Palmer, but they wondered if he had any information about who might have done it. So but Palmer was a man who really had lots of enemies, and I think Kenny Noye less so, and despite there was a fantastic tabloid fodder and pulp that he was always going to get knocked off when he came out of prison, or there was going to be a bloodbath. None of that happened. He's over 4 years out from his sentence. He was released in 2019, and literally it's been, I think, nothing other than a few maybe parking tickets. So it's been very peaceable. So there's no hint of any retribution or any issue like that. And so I think he was a very different character to John Palmer, who, had made lots of enemy, particularly over in Spain. And at the time of John Palmer's death, he was facing potential trial and more investigations in Spain. But when Kenny Noye came back from Spain, and he was forced to come back by extradition, because he didn't concede his extradition and come back, it meant that he could only be charged for the crimes, for the one crime, the murder of Stephen Cameron. So in many ways, he couldn't be charged with any other crime. Whereas Palmer was under pressure in Spain, and it was it's extraordinary that death still remains unsolved. Even more extraordinary that he was shot in broad daylight, and the ambulance was called, and a pathologist kind of examined him, and for a week they thought that they didn't realize he was shot. They just thought he was open wounds in his body was from a hernia operation or some sorts that he'd had that week. So the story and mystery around John Palmer is just another layer to this crazy story.
It's an extraordinary one. Well, Kenneth Noye, and finally, I know you well, and I know how that writing maybe isn't the first and most natural skill that comes to you. You're a broadcaster, you're a great speaker, etc. An amazingly complex story to take on in a book. But I take it you're going to kick back now for a while. This must have been an enormous project.
Well, you know yourself. You knock those books out all the time, and it's
really. I find them very difficult as well.
Well, the thing of it is, effectively I regarded it as 3 months. Once you have the access, and I had full access with Karl, myself and Karl, had full access to Kenneth Noye, and we had full access to Nick Biddis, the two primary characters, the cops and robbers, and so I could pick up the phone at any stage. So I just took 2.5 years of his time on the run and told that story. And, you know, there was a start, middle and end, and it was in that order primarily. And then we just dug and carved out the detail. And I think it was 3 months structuring the book and 3 months of writing the book. But I'm glad to have got it done.
Yeah.
And because the other books I've written have been about myself, which have been terribly boring, and it's just so nice and refreshing to write about somebody else anymore. So, you know, it's not all about me, Donal. So anyway,
look, and it's it is one of the most extraordinary stories, I have to say, that has really, you know, has got tentacles into every aspect of organised crime over the most incredible period of time over the decades. And the fact that Kenneth Noye is still standing and able to tell you his story, or certainly some of it, is incredible. So,
well, I think the key thing is in documentary filmmaking, or in your journalism or my journalism, we've always, you know, we're open to talk to anybody. And I think at some stage, sometimes the most unlikeliest people are willing to talk at the most unlikeliest of times. You always have to be ready for it. And I think we've been very lucky, myself and Karl, my co-author, very lucky to be able to get a little bit of social history and criminal history done with this book. So delighted with it.
And listen, a great lesson in you never know if somebody's going to talk until you ask.
Exactly. Thanks very much, Nicola.
Thank you, Donal.